I have spent the last 72 hours reviewing classified shipping telemetry, IEA emergency briefing transcripts, insurance actuarial tables, and CENTCOM operational disclosures. And what I'm looking at right now is one of the most deliberately misrepresented stories in modern geopolitical memory. Every mainstream headline this morning is telling you that the Strait of Hormuz has reopened, that Iran blinked, that the crisis is de-escalating. And I need you to sit with that narrative for exactly 3 seconds and then throw it away. Here is the operational reality. Even after repeated announcements by both Iran and the United States that Hormuz was open, real-time maritime traffic data shows near total collapse. Vessel transits have fallen to as few as 3 ships per day, compared to well over 120 to 140 under normal conditions. 3 ships per day. That is not a reopening. That is a corpse with a pulse. What mainstream media is completely missing is not the military event itself. It is the architecture of what has been permanently broken. The talking heads are reporting on the announcement of a reopening. I am reporting on the reality of a choke point that has been structurally decommissioned as a trust mechanism for global commerce, possibly for years. The core issue is not the closure. The core issue is trust, not just a physical blockade. I have also been reviewing the insurance actuarial data coming out of London and Miami, and what it tells you about the true cost of reopening will completely alter the way you think about energy pricing through 2027. When Oscar Sikali, the CEO of NSI Insurance Group, states on record that if the situation changes by the hour, the risk becomes almost impossible to price responsibly, that is not a commentary on Iran's military posture. That is a declaration that the global maritime insurance system, the invisible backbone of all seaborne trade, has been knocked offline. The Hormuz story is not a Middle East story. It is a your grocery bill story, a your heating bill story, and a how much your pension fund loses this quarter story. I am about to show you what is actually happening at the geographic, tactical, and macroeconomic level, and none of it is what you are being told. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz functions not merely as a waterway, but as a geopolitical weapon, you must begin with pure physical geography. Because the terrain is what makes Western naval doctrine perpetually vulnerable here, regardless of how many carrier strike groups CENTCOM deploys. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, is just 34 kilometers wide, roughly 21 miles, forming a seaway passage between Iran and Oman. Within that 34-kilometer bottleneck, international maritime law carves out 2 unidirectional shipping lanes, each approximately 3.2 kilometers wide. What this means operationally is that every vessel transiting this passage is, for an extended period of time, operating within effective range of Iranian shore-based systems. There is no maneuver space. There is no tactical depth. A supertanker cannot accelerate, cannot jink, and cannot dive. It is a target in a shooting gallery. Now overlay the Iranian geography. Iran's primary requirement is merely to deter vessels from transiting, as nearly any explosive projectile can destroy oil tankers or LNG carriers. In stark contrast, the United States would need to conduct extensive operations to suppress Iran's coastal military assets before it could guarantee permanent safe passage for vessels. That asymmetry is not a military detail. It is the entire strategic equation. The northern coastline of the strait is controlled by Iran, giving the IRGC elevated terrain, distributed launch positions, and island platforms, most notably Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, from which anti-ship missile systems enjoy overlapping fields of fire. Iran's IRGC inaugurated a new naval base on Keshem Island in Hormozgan province on April 9th, intended to consolidate IRGC control over the waterway. And this was done one day after the ceasefire was announced. That timing is not coincidental. That is a deliberate strategic signal. Iran intends to maintain kinetic leverage over the strait irrespective of the diplomatic track. The subsurface dimension compounds the threat geometry exponentially. The Persian Gulf has an average depth of only 35 meters. That is shallow enough to make mine detection and clearance operations agonizingly slow and technically imprecise. Pentagon officials informed the U.S. House Armed Services Committee on April 21st that it could take 6 months to fully clear the Strait of Hormuz of mines deployed by the Iranian military, and added that any such operation is unlikely to be carried out until the war ends. Meanwhile, the bypass infrastructure that the market is quietly pricing as a pressure valve is almost entirely inadequate. Combined bypass pipeline capacity covers only around 2.6 million barrels per day, a fraction of the 20 million that normally transit Hormuz. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar have no comparable alternative routes. Even in the most optimistic scenario, two-thirds of current Gulf crude exports remain physically dependent on the strait. Traditional Western power projection doctrine, built on sea control, freedom of navigation, and escort operations, was designed for open ocean engagements. It was not designed for a 34-kilometer bottleneck that a peer-tier adversary can render lethally contested with asymmetric tools that cost a fraction of what it takes to neutralize them. That is the foundational strategic reality that CENTCOM is navigating right now and losing. The tactical architecture that Iran deployed to shut the world's most critical energy corridor deserves a clinical, methodical dissection because it is a masterclass in asymmetric warfare that has fundamentally rewritten the cost-benefit calculus of maritime choke point interdiction. On February 28, 2026, within hours of Operation Epic Fury, the coordinated U.S.-Israeli airstrike campaign that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps broadcast a chilling message over VHF radio to every vessel in the area. No ship was permitted to pass. The IRGC did not need to fire a single shot in that initial moment to achieve strategic effect. The warning alone, transmitted over an internationally monitored maritime frequency, was sufficient to trigger an avalanche of actuarial recalculations inside Lloyd's of London, Singapore, and Zurich. Within 72 hours, war risk insurance premiums for Hormuz transit had become commercially prohibitive for most operators, effectively closing the strait before the IRGC had to sink a single hull. This is the first lesson of the Hormuz engagement. The weapon was not kinetic, it was informational. A credible threat delivered over VHF radio that exploited the insurance architecture of global maritime commerce. The kinetic layering came in sequentially. The IRGC boarded and attacked merchant ships and laid sea mines throughout the strait. Mine warfare is the IRGC's most cost-effective and durable tool in this environment. An Iranian IRGC naval mine costs, in equivalent dollar terms, somewhere between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on variant. A VLCC supertanker, a very large crude carrier, is insured for anywhere from 80 million to 150 million. The cost-exchange ratio is so asymmetric that it borders on absurd. Worse, the mine does not even need to detonate to achieve operational effect. The mere possibility of mine presence forces commercial operators to suspend bookings and forces insurers to withdraw coverage. By April 21st, U.S. officials confirmed that fewer than 10 mines had been physically verified in the strait. Two Navy destroyers, the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Michael Murphy, transited to begin demining operations. But here's the operational dilemma that no briefer in Washington wants to articulate plainly. Analysts warn that sweeping the Strait of Hormuz clear of mines with complete certainty is a near impossible task. If any risk of mines remains, this will deter insurers and halt traffic. In a 35-meter deep, 34-kilometer wide, bottom current active sea environment, the detection threshold required to satisfy maritime insurers is effectively perfect. And perfect mine clearance does not exist. Beyond mines, the IRGC deployed a layered, asymmetric maritime interdiction system. Fast attack craft, small radar-evasive speedboats operating in swarm configurations, harassed and boarded vessels. A sea drone struck the oil tanker Sonangol Namibe near Mubarak al-Kabir port in Kuwait, more than 800 kilometers from the strait, representing a significant geographic expansion of the conflict zone. This range extension was tactically deliberate. It forced commercial shipping companies and their insurers to recalculate the threat envelope not merely at the strait itself, but across the entire Persian Gulf basin. The IRGC also exploited electromagnetic ambiguity as a force multiplier. Reports emerged that Iran had lost track of some of the mines it planted, meaning it may be unable to fully open the strait even if it wanted to. That detail is extraordinary in its strategic implications. The IRGC may have created a threat they cannot fully control or retract, which means that even genuine diplomatic resolution cannot guarantee physical safety of transit. The mine threat becomes, in effect, self-sustaining. Contrast this with what the United States would need to do to guarantee safe passage. The operational framework would require intensive and targeted bombardment of coastal areas, maximize suppression of mobile missile launchers using existing capabilities, and naval escort of vessels toward a secure corridor. According to the latest CENTCOM update on Operation Epic Fury, approximately 6,000 targets across Iran have already been struck since operations commenced on February 28th. 6,000 targets, and the strait is still not commercially operational. The military dimension, including mines, drone warfare, electronic jamming, and IRGC speedboats, creates a risk environment that commercial operators cannot safely ignore regardless of diplomatic progress. The critical takeaway for this audience: Iran spent, at most, tens of millions of dollars to shut down a waterway that moves 20 million barrels of oil per day. The United States has expended billions in kinetic operations and still cannot restore the trust that commercial shipping requires to function. Cheap, distributed, deniable, asymmetric tools have defeated the most powerful conventional naval force on Earth, not by sinking its ships, but by making commerce itself impossible. The macroeconomic transmission mechanism from this tactical engagement to the wallets of consumers in Chicago, Berlin, Tokyo, and Mumbai is now fully active, and the numbers are severe enough that they warrant serious attention from every investor, macro trader, and pension fund manager currently positioned in energy, equities, or fixed income. Start with the headline figure that every energy market participant should have memorized. Crude and oil product flows through the Strait of Hormuz plunged from around 20 million barrels per day before the war to just over 2 million barrels per day by March. Gulf countries have cut total oil production by more than 14 million barrels per day. The IEA's own executive director has described this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The price trajectory has been steep and is not finished. Following the closure of the strait, Brent crude surged past $120 per barrel and forced Qatar Energy to declare force majeure on all exports. Estimates from energy analysts indicate that without a medium-term crisis management solution, prices could reach $120 per barrel and in the long term, potentially approach $200. At $170 a barrel, the impact on inflation and growth roughly doubles, a stagflationary shock that could shift everything from the path ahead for central banks to the outcome of electoral cycles. The LNG dimension of this crisis is arguably more structurally damaging than the crude oil disruption because there are no bypass alternatives for gas. Global supply of liquefied natural gas has been reduced by around 20% due to the situation. The Ras Laffan facility in Qatar, the largest liquefaction facility in the world, has been offline since it was first attacked on March 2nd. Europe, which had already entered this crisis with historically low gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh 2025-2026 winter, saw Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly double to over $60 per megawatt hour by mid-March. The asymmetry of vulnerability across Asian economies is particularly acute. Japan depends on imported fossil fuels for 87% of its total energy use, and 95% of its crude oil imports originate from the Middle East. Japan alone imports 1.6 million barrels per day through the strait. A sustained closure would widen its trade deficit sharply, weaken the yen, and tip the economy towards stagflation. South Korea channels approximately 68% of its crude imports through Hormuz, some 1.7 million barrels per day. The maritime insurance market is now itself a systemic risk factor. Baker Hughes is working under the assumption that the Strait of Hormuz may not fully reopen until the second half of 2026. A Dallas Fed energy survey found that nearly 80% of oil and gas executives believe the strait will not reopen until August or later. Baker Hughes' CFO has already stated that oil and LNG prices will face persistent risk premiums. That language, persistent risk premium, is the phrase that matters for your portfolio. It means elevated energy costs are being structurally baked into forward pricing curves, not treated as a temporary spike. The Dallas Federal Reserve has modeled that a closure of the strait that removes close to 20% of global oil supplies from the market during Q2 2026 is expected to raise the average WTI price of oil to $98 per barrel and lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in that quarter alone. The unipolar world order's most exposed flank is not military, it is logistical. The assumption upon which globalization was built, frictionless maritime trade through stable choke points, has been operationally falsified in the Persian Gulf, and choke points have now been demonstrated to be active instruments of power, not passive geographic features. Every shipping line, every commodity trader, and every institutional investor is now repricing that reality. The era of efficiency-optimized global supply chains is over. The era of resilience at cost has begun. I have been running these scenarios for the past week, and I keep arriving at the same bleak fork in the road. And I want you to sit with it carefully, because there is no clean exit. Washington can escalate. It can triple mine clearance operations, extend the naval blockade of Iranian ports, and ramp up kinetic pressure on remaining IRGC coastal infrastructure. But every escalation step risks a direct military confrontation with Iranian forces that could trigger retaliatory strikes on Saudi Aramco infrastructure, potentially removing another 7 to 10 million barrels per day from a market that is already bleeding. At $170 Brent, the United States tips into stagflation, the Federal Reserve loses its policy optionality, and the political cost to Washington becomes unsurvivable. Or Washington can negotiate. It can accept Iranian demands, most likely relief from the U.S. port blockade and some form of sanctions restructuring, and achieve a functional reopening of commercial transit. But every concession Tehran extracts from this negotiation permanently validates the IRGC's asymmetric playbook. The message sent to every revisionist actor watching, from Beijing to Pyongyang to Moscow, is that a few dozen sea mines and a fleet of speedboats can hold the global economy hostage. There is no path forward that does not carry catastrophic risk on one end or strategic capitulation on the other. That is the dilemma I am asking you to assess today. Drop your tactical analysis in the comments. What does Washington do next? Escalate or negotiate, and at what cost? Subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's briefing covers how China is exploiting this crisis to accelerate its long-term energy decoupling strategy, and that one will hit differently.